February 12, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The dawn of death arrived on bent wings. The morning sun cast long shadows across the coral runway as 24 dark blue fighters sat silent on the flight line. Major William Geese checked his watch. 0600 hours. In 2 hours, these Marine F4U Corsairs would fly their first combat mission in the Pacific War. Not a routine patrol, not a training flight, an escort mission 230 miles deep into Japanese-controlled airspace to Vella La Vella. What none of the pilots knew was that this single squadron's arrival would trigger the most devastating fighter campaign in the Solomon Islands. The Japanese had ruled these skies for over a year. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters had become legend, untouchable, unbeatable, masters of the air. That legend was about to die. The Pacific War had taught American forces a brutal lesson. Control the air, control the battlefield. Lose the air, lose everything. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots had demonstrated superiority in training, tactics, and technology. The Zero could outturn any American fighter. It could climb faster, fly farther. And its veteran pilots had been blooded in China, perfecting their craft against inferior opposition. The Imperial Japanese Navy's elite air groups stationed at Rabaul represented the finest concentration of naval aviation in the Pacific. 700 aircraft, pilots with hundreds of combat hours, veterans who had swept aside the British at Singapore, the Dutch in the East Indies, the Americans at Pearl Harbor. But on this humid morning, as coral dust settled on those bent-wing fighters, everything was about to change. The men who would fly the Corsair were not aces. They were young Americans, most in their early 20s, with minimal combat experience. Farm boys from Iowa who had never seen the ocean before joining the Marines. College graduates who had given up comfortable futures for gold wings. Former mechanics and store clerks who had discovered an aptitude for flying. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124 had logged only 25 hours in the Corsair before arriving at Guadalcanal. A former enlisted man who had earned his wings through determination rather than Annapolis pedigree, Walsh understood machinery. Born in Brooklyn and raised in Jersey City, he had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1933 at age 17. He had worked as an aircraft mechanic before earning his wings, giving him an intimate understanding of what made aircraft work and what made them fail. Across the Solomon Sea at Rabaul, the Japanese prepared for another day of air operations. The sprawling base complex included 5 airfields. Simpson Harbor provided anchorage for cruisers and destroyers. The town itself housed thousands of support personnel, mechanics, armorers, communications specialists. It was the Gibraltar of the South Pacific, seemingly impregnable behind its ring of fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Lieutenant Toshio Ota of the 204th Air Group reviewed the morning reconnaissance reports. American strength at Guadalcanal. Estimated 40 to 50 fighters, mixed types, mostly obsolete P-42s and stubby F-4F Wildcats. Nothing the Zeros could not handle. But the morning's reconnaissance photos showed something new. 24 aircraft with distinctive bent wings. The F4U Corsair sat on Henderson Field's dusty coral surface like a caged predator. Its inverted gull wings gave it an unmistakable silhouette, a profile that would soon haunt Japanese pilots' nightmares. Powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, the Corsair could achieve speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The massive 13-foot 4-inch Hamilton standard propeller required the distinctive bent-wing design to provide adequate ground clearance. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, each firing 750 rounds per minute. Total ammunition load, 2,350 rounds. Enough firepower to saw a zero in half with a 2-second burst. But raw specifications told only part of the story. The Corsair was initially considered too dangerous for carrier operations. Its long nose blocked forward visibility during landing. Its left wing stalled before the right, causing vicious snap rolls at low speed. The Navy had rejected it for carrier duty, declaring it an ensign eliminator. Yet these very characteristics that made it dangerous to fly would make it lethal in combat. The same power that made it difficult to control gave it unmatched acceleration and climb rate. The robust construction that added weight also meant it could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter fighters. The Corsair was not just an airplane. It was 14,000 pounds of controlled violence. Master its temperament, and you held death's own scythe. At Rabaul, Japanese intelligence had no designation for the new American fighter. Probably another failed design rushed into service. VMF 124's first combat mission began at 0800 on February 12, 1943. 12 Corsairs lifted off from Henderson Field to escort a PBY Catalina rescue mission to Vella La Vella. The mission profile was straightforward. Provide top cover while the flying boat retrieved 2 downed pilots. No enemy contact expected. A milk run to blood the new squadron. The Corsairs climbed steadily to 18,000 feet, their engines running smoothly in the cool morning air. Major Guise led the formation, constantly scanning the sky for threats. The Japanese had a habit of appearing from nowhere, usually out of the sun. 20 minutes into the flight, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh spotted movement below. 9 Zeros climbing from the southeast, positioning for an attack on the lumbering Catalina. Walsh's voice crackled over the radio. Bandits! 8 o'clock low. Climbing. The moment of truth had arrived. 12 American rookies in an untested fighter against 9 Japanese veterans in the war's most successful aircraft. Walsh rolled inverted and pulled through in a split S, diving from 18,000 feet. The Corsair accelerated like nothing he had ever flown. The airspeed indicator swept past 350-400, 425 miles per hour. At this speed, the Zeros could not follow even if they tried. Their wings would fail under the stress. He lined up on the trailing enemy fighter, waited until the wingspan filled his gun sight, and squeezed the trigger. 6 streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds converged at 900 feet. The Japanese fighter disintegrated. The Zero did not explode. It did not catch fire. It simply came apart in the air like a toy smashed by an invisible hammer. Wings separated from fuselage. The engine tore free from its mounts. The pilot never had a chance to bail out. Walsh pulled up hard, G-forces crushing him into his seat, and shandled back toward altitude. 1 pass, 1 kill. The other Corsairs followed his example, diving and climbing, using their superior speed to slash through the Japanese formation. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. When the Zeros fled, 3 of their number were falling toward the sea in pieces. No Corsairs were lost. Not one had even been hit. The tactical equation had shifted dramatically. The hunters had become the hunted. The remaining Japanese fighters retreated north at maximum speed. They had witnessed something that challenged everything they believed about air combat. Their Zeros, which could outturn any American fighter, had been slaughtered without landing a single hit. That evening at Rabaul, the debriefing was somber. The surviving pilots reported encountering a new American fighter with unprecedented speed and firepower. Their report was detailed and troubling. Encountered new American fighter type over Vela Lavella. Superior speed and dive characteristics, exceptional firepower, cannot engage in traditional turning combat, armor protection negates effectiveness of 7.7 millimeter armament. The report was the first acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed in the air war over the Solomons. The Japanese had perfected their tactics over years of combat. Now, in 4 minutes, those tactics had become obsolete. Within a week, Japanese pilots had given the new American fighter a name: Whistling Death. The designation came from the distinctive sound the Corsair made in a high-speed dive, a banshee wail created by air rushing through the oil cooler intakes in the wing roots. It was a sound that would precede devastation, a war cry that announced execution from above. Ground troops on Japanese-held islands learned to fear it. When they heard that whistle, death was seconds away. The impact was immediate and profound. Japanese bomber missions to Guadalcanal, previously escorted by a dozen fighters, now required 20 or 30. Even then, losses were heavy. The Corsair's speed advantage meant it could choose when and how to engage. Japanese pilots found themselves constantly on the defensive, trying to protect bombers while being picked apart by slashing attacks they could not counter. By March 1943, all 8 Marine fighter squadrons in the Solomons were converting to Corsairs. The transition was not without cost. 7 aircraft were lost to operational accidents in the first month. Victims of the Corsair's unforgiving flight characteristics, landing accidents were common. The long nose meant pilots could not see the runway during final approach. But those who mastered the bent-wing bird found themselves in possession of a weapon that could dominate any opponent. The Corsair changed everything about air combat in the Pacific. American pilots abandoned the turning dogfights that had favored the agile Zero. Instead, they employed boom and zoom tactics, diving attacks from altitude, firing, then climbing away before the enemy could respond. The Japanese tried to adapt. New tactics were developed at training bases in Japan. Coordinated attacks from multiple angles, attempts to force Corsairs into low-speed turning fights, targeting the aircraft's few vulnerable spots: the oil cooler intakes, the cockpit canopy rails where armor was thinnest. But each adaptation was countered by American improvements. When Japanese pilots learned to attack from directly astern to avoid the forward-firing guns, Corsair pilots adopted the thatch weave, a defensive maneuver that guaranteed mutual support. When Zeros tried to exploit their superior climb rate at low speeds, Corsairs simply refused to engage below 250 miles per hour. On April 1st, 1943, Lieutenant Walsh led 4 Corsairs on a fighter sweep over the Russell Islands. 30 Zeros rose to intercept them. In previous encounters, such odds would have meant certain death for American pilots. But Walsh had studied the Corsairs' capabilities and developed new tactics. The Corsairs maintained altitude advantage, made coordinated diving attacks, and covered each other's climbing recovery. The battle developed into a vertical fight, with Corsairs diving from 20,000 feet, firing, then zoom climbing back to altitude. The Zeros trying to follow found themselves hanging on their props, struggling to maintain airspeed. At that moment, they were sitting ducks. Walsh personally destroyed 3 Zeros in 7 minutes. His wingman shot down 2 more. The 4 Corsairs claimed 11 victories without loss. When they landed at Henderson Field, mechanics counted only 6 bullet holes among all 4 aircraft. The Zero's guns could not penetrate the Corsairs' armor. The numbers became impossible to ignore. 13-1. Then 20-1. Kill ratios that should not exist in combat between professional pilots. By May 13, 1943, Kenneth Walsh had achieved what no American pilot had done before. He became the first Corsair ace with 5 confirmed victories. Instead of running, he attacked. Using the Corsair's superior speed, he made 3 passes, shooting down 1 Zero on each pass. The last Japanese pilot, probably a veteran given his aggressive maneuvering, tried to force Walsh into a turning fight at 5,000 feet. Walsh responded by going vertical, climbing straight up until the Zero stalled and fell away. He then rolled over and dove, catching the Zero as it tried to recover. 2 weeks later, Walsh's score stood at 10. The transformation was remarkable. In 3 months, a pilot with minimal experience in a rejected Navy fighter had become one of America's leading aces. But Walsh was not alone. Dozens of Marine pilots were discovering what the Corsair could do. Lieutenant Robert Hansen of VMF 215 would eventually score 25 victories in just 6 months, making him the highest-scoring Corsair ace of the war. The real shock for Japanese pilots came not from individual aces, but from the collective effectiveness of Corsair squadrons. On June 16, 1943, over 100 Japanese aircraft launched from Rabaul to attack American shipping at Guadalcanal. They were met by 32 Corsairs. 77 Japanese aircraft were destroyed for the loss of 6 Corsairs. The strategic implications rippled across the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death in April 1943, shot down by P-38 Lightnings, made possible by Corsair suppression of Japanese fighters, eliminated Japan's most capable naval strategist. The isolation and reduction of Rabaul, achieved through Corsair air superiority, removed Japan's most important base without invasion. The Marine island-hopping campaign accelerated, each landing supported by Corsair squadrons that guaranteed American forces would never again fight without air cover. Captain Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's foremost aerial strategist, assessed the situation with characteristic honesty. The Corsair has made our entire naval aviation doctrine obsolete. We trained for 20 years to fight a war that no longer exists. The Americans changed the rules, built a better aircraft, and trained better pilots. We cannot catch up. We can only die with honor. The human cost was staggering. Japan lost approximately 2,000 naval aviators in the Solomons campaign, the majority to Corsairs. These were not just pilots, but instructors, squadron commanders, and tactical innovators. Irreplaceable expertise accumulated over decades. The pre-war Japanese Navy had required 3 years to train a carrier pilot. By 1944, they were sending boys to combat with less than 6 months of training. The results were predictable and tragic. American losses, while significant, were sustainable. Industrial production delivered Corsairs faster than combat consumed them. By 1944, Vought was producing 300 Corsairs per month, one every 82 minutes. Ensign Teo Yamamoto arrived at Rabaul in March 1944 with just 90 hours total flight time. He survived exactly one encounter with Corsairs. His diary, recovered after the war, contained a single entry. Saw the bent-wing devils today. 3 of my training class are dead. I ran. I am ashamed, but I am alive. Tomorrow I will probably join them. The Americans are not fighting fair. They are simply executing us. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, encountered Corsairs over Iwo Jima in June 1944. Despite his vast experience, over 60 victories, he barely survived. His Zero was riddled with bullets, his cockpit filled with smoke. Only exceptional flying skill allowed him to escape. His assessment was blunt. Fighting Corsairs in a Zero was like fighting a modern tank with a cavalry sword. Brave, perhaps, but stupid and fatal. The psychological impact exceeded even the tactical success. Japanese pilots, who had never known defeat, began to experience fear. The distinctive whistle of a diving Corsair became a sound that triggered primitive terror. Ground crews at forward bases reported pilots refusing missions when Corsair presence was confirmed. The mystique of Japanese air superiority, carefully cultivated since the war's beginning, evaporated in the heat of Corsair gun barrels. Young pilots arrived in theater, were briefed on the bent-wing devils, flew one mission, and died. Sometimes entire formations were wiped out without achieving a single victory. It was not combat. It was execution. The Japanese knew it. The Americans knew it. And both sides understood what it meant for the war's outcome. By August 1945, Corsairs had destroyed 2,140 Japanese aircraft in air-to-air combat. They had dropped 15,621 tons of bombs, 70% of all bombs delivered by U.S. Navy and Marine fighters during the Pacific War. The aircraft that could not initially operate from carriers had become the most successful naval fighter in history. Production would continue until 1953, with 12,571 Corsairs built, the longest production run of any World War II fighter. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, was direct. Without the Corsair, the island-hopping campaign would have been impossible. It was the key that unlocked Japanese defenses across the Pacific. The final testament came from an unexpected source. Emperor Hirohito, in his post-war memoir, identified 3 factors that made Japan's defeat inevitable: American industrial capacity, the atomic bomb, and the Corsair fighter. When our pilots could no longer contest the skies, he wrote, our islands became indefensible. The Corsair was the sword that cut the Empire's lifeline. Sakai, who survived the war with 64 victories, provided perhaps the most eloquent assessment. The Zero was a rapier, light, agile, deadly in skilled hands. The Corsair was a broadsword, heavy, powerful, crushing everything in its path. The Americans had 10 broadswords for every rapier we possessed, and they did not need to be samurai to use them effectively. The age of the individual warrior ace was ending. The age of systematic technological air supremacy had arrived. On a humid morning in September 1945, as American occupation forces landed in Japan, a formation of Marine Corsairs flew overhead. Their bent wings cast shadows over Tokyo Bay, where 2 years earlier, Japanese pilots had been supreme. The war was over, but the message was clear. The age of the samurai of the sky had ended. The age of American air power, born in the crucible of the Solomons and forged in the engine of the Corsair, had begun. The last Japanese ace to face Corsairs in combat, Lieutenant Kaneyoshi Muto, survived the war with 18 victories. Asked years later about fighting the American fighter, he smiled sadly. "You want to know about fighting Corsairs? Here is the truth. You did not fight Corsairs. You survived them if you were very lucky and very fast. Most of us were neither." The bent-wing bird was death itself, and death always wins in the end. In the depths of the Pacific Ocean, scattered across thousands of miles, rest the aluminum bones of fallen aircraft. Zeros and Corsairs alike bear silent witness to the air war's savage intensity. But the ratio tells the tale. For every Corsair on the ocean floor, 11 zeros rest beside it. The calculus of victory, written in metal and measured in lives, proved that when technology, training, and industrial might converged, the result was not battle, execution. The Corsair had not just won a war, it had revolutionized the very nature of air combat, proving that superior technology, properly employed, could overcome any advantage in skill or experience. Death always wins in the end. And in 1943, death had bent wings.